Hi Alberto, welcome.
Hello, David. Well met.
Nice to have you here. We're doing the first of a series of interviews, the speakers at the crossover conference in Dublin on June the 17th. Alberto Cottica is well known as a researcher and as a hacker. And he's here to speak about his experience in researching and practicing how network science can be applied to policymaking. So, Alberto, tell us a little bit about your work in this field. Briefly, what's the main topic of your activity in this domain?
Well, the first thing that I should say is that networks, graphs, are an abstract mathematical object. So, in principle, it can be used in a pretty large number of ways, a fairly general modeling tool. My own interest is in using networks to understand and hopefully design online conversations. This feeds into the field of open government that we both care about through the participation and collaboration pillars. So the idea is that citizens would come together, helping institutions to devise and possibly even to execute public policies. And that will happen through some kind of aggregation mechanism, because of course there's very many citizens, and it's easy for these processes to break down, to become unmanageable. Online conversation is one candidate towards being an aggregation mechanism, and network science can help to detect healthy conversation patterns. For example, if you think of a flame war, you could imagine somebody answering to somebody, somebody answering to the same person all over again, and then you'd get the sort of branch of the network which you can visualize very easily. That's a flame war for you, or it's two people falling in love, but anyway, it's two people that are talking to each other rather than feeding in the larger conversation. You don't have to know what they're saying to know this. You don't have to know what they're saying to know that they're sort of detaching, they're drifting off from the general conversation, they're not contributing. So this is, of course, a caricature, but this is where I'm going. However, it should be noted that network science has other applications. For example, a very promising one is to look at webs of collaboration between different partners. For example, think of universities joining together to do research projects, or companies joining together to win tenders. Now again, looking at the patterns of collaboration, you might detect things like cartels, or you might look for ways through which good practices can spread, vice versa. So we are still at the beginning of the journey.
So it's a little bit to answer the long-standing question: how to have conversations with thousands and thousands of people, how to make sense of this large-scale conversation. There's a lot of research going on opinion mining, which deals more with the content, while you are more interested in the structure. Can this be a way to see this? So not what is being said, but by whom and how?
I think so. I mean, look, this is the holy grail of this whole field. Like, how do you make sense of a very large conversation? The semantic analysis is very interesting, and a lot of people are looking that way. For now, the available tools seem to me to be too blunt. And this may change, and I may be wrong even now, but this is my sort of informed guess. Now, one thing that I like about network analysis is that it doesn't absolve you from actually reading the content. So the idea is that you would use network analysis to detect interesting dynamics, and then you would go in and read. But you would do it with a human eye. I don't think we can trust yet automated mechanisms to harvest online content. I hope I'm proven wrong, and in fact I'm doing interesting work with colleagues at MIT and Open University and others, and they are convinced that I'm wrong. So this is going to be
good. I just missed the last part. This is going to be
an interesting conversation.
Okay, sorry, it got cut. Okay, so but I understand that not only you research how could this be done in theory, but you also done some experiments. Could you make us an example of how you have used this in as also as a community manager, if you want, or as a community designer, how this has been useful to you?
Well, yes, the whole thing starts. I'm not an academic. I'm a practitioner. So the whole thing starts when I'm trying to build tools in order for me to use them to do my work as somebody that is executing somehow online collaboration between government and citizens. And one such case is the case of a Council of Europe project called Edge Riders that's come to an end in 2012. The Edge Riders community grew to a point where it was under suspicion of becoming overwhelming. And so one interesting question is, okay, so we've got a pretty big number of users in there, but how is the experience of the users? How does it look from the point of view of the users? And you can do that through an algorithm called modularity detection algorithm that would take the conversation and would look for the existence of subcommunities. In a subcommunity, the members speak to each other more than they speak to the rest of the network, even though they may still, and in fact they are, in the case in question, connected to the rest of the network. So this, you can think of this as a mechanism that facilitates scaling, because even if the network gets larger and larger, it's not necessarily the case that the people in the network are talking to more and more and more and more people. They are just talking to people that are talking to people. And this keeps the conversation reasonably manageable and orderly, as long as the number of the people involved in each subcommunity is a Dunbar number, as was the case. Yeah. So, in principle, what we are looking at is, at least in the sense of scaling, we are looking at a healthy growth. More people come in. This doesn't result in an increase of the level of noise from the point of view of the user. It results in an increasing level of self-organization of the network.
So it is also a tool that can help you, for example, understanding whether online engagement results, as some critics say, into balkanization, into more filter bubbles where conversation happens within your own circles, and it becomes basically a tool not to discover and to integrate, but to actually close with your own circle. So it could be a tool that helps you understanding, you mentioned healthy or unhealthy, but also to what extent the filter bubble, for example, is a reality, to what extent circles are becoming self-referential or not.
This is an excellent example. I believe this was one of the first applications of network analysis to the online conversation. It goes back to the early 2000s, I guess, when people started looking at the blogosphere. And there's famous studies from the United States where you would get the scene of liberal blogs and sort of Republican-leaning sort of blogs, and you would look at the pattern of mutual linking. And what you would get is, unsurprisingly, you would get that liberal blogs would link more to liberal blogs than they would link to conservative blogs. However, there was a giant component. There was some linking that was going on across the partisan divide. What that means is that there is some sort of taking on board the other part's point of view, even if only to critique it. So you need a rule of thumb. You need to know whether you want say one group to link to their own side, political side, exactly in the same measure as they link to the other side or not. Certainly, if you saw a complete divide, that would be probably a filter bubble, a perfect filter bubble, as you say. some amount of it is probably acceptable. You still need a rule of thumb, you still need a threshold, but what network analysis does for you is that you can measure precisely how close you are to that threshold.
Okay, and you also have a unique experience when you organize this event in Venice with policymakers. What is the perception of network science from policymakers? Is it something where they see the utility? Is it already perceived as a useful tool, or is just seen as, okay, that's a nice to have a futuristic tool, but look, at the moment we've got more concrete problems? What were the reactions of policymakers?
Well, the people that showed up at this event, called Masters of Networks, the idea was exactly to bring together network scientists and policymakers, were probably a biased group. So they thought it was a serious tool, and they thought it was a good idea to take it seriously. My first impression is that they tended to collapse the idea of network into that of social network. So they didn't see so much a mathematical tool, with exceptions. They did see very clearly how that would be useful as a way to map communities that interact, especially local communities. The obstacle there is to, in a way, unlearn what your common sense tells you about, communities coming together, because we are all parts of local communities and we think we know how they work. But in fact, we don't. When large numbers and interactions are involved, you get into complex system territory, and human intuition is not necessarily a good guide for that. So we had some pretty lively conversation around that, and that tells me that we still need to do some work to deprogram ourselves from our intuition, and possibly to do a good job at popularization of the science. So let me give you an example. We had a lot of conversation about the Doris. Doris is the fictional character that knows everybody in a local community. And it just makes sense, if you can get to the person that knows everybody, then your policy will be a success, information will spread quickly. That's the person that makes things happen. And in fact, we have some science saying that there is no proof of the existence of connectors in that sense. And fast spreading of information across networks seems to be more a property of the general connectivity pattern rather than a property of certain special individuals within the network. And that makes sense too, because, hey, if there is some person in a local community that knows everybody, you don't even need to do any network analysis. Whoever you tell, every policy will succeed because everybody knows Doris and Doris knows everybody else. So if your former policies didn't spread, probably there is no Doris. But this notion is counterintuitive and people tend to fight against it. It takes some training to say, okay, this is my intuition, it's probably wrong, let me trust the data rather than the intuition.
Good. You mentioned some limits, some lack of awareness, but also the need for awareness raising. What are the main bottlenecks? So let's imagine a future where actually network science between a ready-made tool available to all policymakers. What are the main bottlenecks? Is it, I see at the moment, to be honest, you need to be quite a geek to use network science. So is this a problem of usability? What are the current tools missing?
In my own work, I think a step in the right direction, meaning that it would make it a little more palatable to the rest of us, would be to have dynamic network analysis. And the reason for that is that network science is born in such an abstract domain that there was really never no need to follow individual agents in the network, individual nodes in the network as they change their state. So it's all a completely mathematical analysis of a fully abstract object. we don't even have the mathematics to do network analysis over time. I should get quite technical to explain this, but for the moment, just take my word for it. And this is really not that great, because we like to see things evolving, and when we see things evolving, we can tell stories to ourselves about how that movement actually played out, and we can look for causes and we can make hypotheses. If we can't do that, then we are sort of at a loss. So I'm personally involved in trying to combine network analysis with panel data techniques that will recuperate, will gather the time dimension and put it into network science, so that people can sort of look at an evolving system and get a better feeling of how it evolves.
That's wonderful, but it's quite futuristic. So let's now get into the work of awareness raising that you proposed. So let's make something about some examples of where network science did the difference, or rather, if you want, where the absence of network science led to major mistakes in the policy domain. I mean, just as it doesn't have to be the top example, but something that comes to mind where it shows, look, if network science can make a difference in the way you plan and you implement and you evaluate your policies.
Well, for me, a promising area, and we've done some work in Venice around that, even though it's very preliminary, is antitrust policy. Because what you can do is you can map out a relationship between different companies doing things. That's traditionally done using corporate control, so who owns stock in whom, but you can also look at projects. And in fact, this is the application that we found in Venice, where we had some data around UNDP, United Nations Development Program suppliers. So we had a lot of projects, tenders put out there by the UNDP, and who won those tenders. And typically one tender was won not just by one company, but by a partnership of companies. And some of those companies might have been also partnering up in other tenders successfully. So what you could see is you could see whether there was some sort of little clique of people that would sort of gang up together and try to get all of the contracts, or rather, if they would just change, maybe a group of 10 companies would just change one and act as a gatekeeper, so that in order for a peripheral company to access UNDP contracts, then you would have to go through those guys. And all of the stuff becomes really easy to measure. Then it's not so easy to interpret, but if as with all empirical analysis, this comes with experience and with discussion out in the open. Certainly, we were able in 3 hours to start from the data set and get a pretty nice bird's eye view. Pretty nice bird's eye view visualization of how this market played out.
Very, very interesting, actually, because it also points out to the potential of linking open data, open government data, in this case procurement data, with the network science. So it shows how network science spans well beyond social networks, but into other domains. So that's great, Alberto. That was really insightful, and I would like to continue this conversation, but we'll continue it in Dublin. Do you have any last hint that we missed in the conversation that you want to share with our viewers?
Not really. I mean, I really care about the stuff, and I tend to rant about it, so maybe it's better when I stop while I'm winning.
Fantastic. Many thanks, Alberto.
Many thanks, David.